At 9 a.m. on February 19, 1945, Corporal Dalton Kessler pressed his face into the black volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, gripping a weapon his sergeant had called a suicide idea 3 months earlier. 23 years old, 6 combat missions, 0 conventional kills. The Japanese had fortified every meter of this 8-square-mile rock with 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, 17,000 defenders, and overlapping fields of fire that turned the beach into a killing ground. The standard-issue Browning M1919 machine guns were effective, but they weighed 31 pounds empty and fired 400 rounds per minute. Good for defense, terrible for assault. Around Kessler, Marines from Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines were pinned down by concentrated machine gun and mortar fire from camouflaged pillboxes they could not see. By mid-morning, the 5th Marine Division had already lost 43 men. In Kessler's hands lay something doctrine said should not exist: an AN/M2 aircraft machine gun salvaged from a crashed Douglas SBD Dauntless, welded to a modified M1 Garand stock, fitted with a solenoid trigger of his own fabrication and capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. The weapon weighed 25 pounds total, 10 pounds lighter than the standard gun, and could deliver 3 times the rate of fire. Every officer who had seen it called it dangerous. Every regulation in the Marine Corps prohibited field modifications of this scope. But regulations had not saved Private Hendricks, who died yesterday when his machine gun crew could not set up fast enough on the volcanic slopes. Regulations had not saved Corporal Santiago, who bled out in the ash while waiting for suppressive fire that never came. And regulations would not save the Marines dying around him right now. Kessler shifted his position slightly, feeling the volcanic grit work its way into every piece of his equipment. The weapon beside him represented 18 months of mechanical intuition, 3 months of secret construction, and a lifetime of distrust toward anyone who claimed factory specifications were sacred. His father had died believing in factory specifications. The combine harvester had been built exactly to design requirements, inspected according to protocol, operated within recommended parameters. The microfracture in the drive shaft had not been visible to standard inspection methods. When it failed, taking his father with it, 15-year-old Dalton learned that specifications were starting points, not gospel. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima tasted like sulfur and death. Somewhere ahead, Japanese machine gunners waited in positions that had been planned for months, dug by engineers who understood that overlapping fields of fire could stop any assault the Americans might attempt. The standard response was to call for naval gunfire or air support, but close air support could not see targets this well concealed, and naval shells could not reach into the carefully angled firing ports of these positions. What the Japanese had not planned for was a farm mechanic from Nebraska who understood that sometimes the best solution came from the parts bin of a crashed aircraft, and the workshop skills learned fixing equipment that corporate engineers had never seen fail in the field. In 4 minutes, this improvised weapon would either prove that innovation could triumph over doctrine, or Dalton Kessler would die with the reputation of a fool who trusted salvaged aircraft parts more than Marine Corps wisdom. But to understand why a farm boy would stake his life on a weapon built from scrap metal and electrical components, the story had to start 3 months earlier, in a maintenance shed in Hawaii, where regulations met reality and were lost. Before we continue this story, let us know where you are listening from. United States, Canada, or somewhere else entirely. We want to understand the global community following these historical accounts. November 1944, Camp Tarawa, Hawaii. The maintenance shed smelled like hydraulic fluid, gun oil, and the perpetual dampness that came from operating machinery in tropical humidity. Sergeant Wade Brennan stood over the dismantled remains of an AN/M2 aircraft machine gun, turning a bolt over in his hands like a man examining evidence of a crime. Brennan was 31 years old, a career Marine who had survived Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and Guam, by understanding that the difference between living and dying often came down to who could deliver the most firepower in the shortest time. At Bougainville, his entire squad had been wiped out during an assault when their M1919 crew could not establish a firing position fast enough to suppress Japanese defenders. Brennan had watched 9 men die while machine gunners struggled with the 90-second setup time required to get their weapon into action. The aircraft gun at his feet represented a different philosophy of warfare, designed for aerial combat where weight and rapid engagement mattered more than sustained defensive fire. The AN/M2 could fire 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute from a mount that weighed half as much as the standard infantry weapon. But it had no stock, no infantry sights, and no way for a single Marine to carry and operate it effectively. Corporal Dalton Kessler appeared in the doorway of the maintenance shed at 11:30 p.m., carrying a tool bag that contained items not found in any official Marine Corps kit. Wire cutters modified for electrical work, sheet metal shears, a small arc welder he had borrowed from the motor pool and never returned, welding rods, battery cables, and a mechanical aptitude that had been developed not in military schools, but in Nebraska farm equipment lots where broken machinery meant failed harvests and economic disaster. Kessler was not an imposing figure. 5 feet 9 inches tall, 160 pounds, with the kind of build that came from years of wrestling with farm equipment rather than gymnasium training. His face was unremarkable except for his eyes, which had the focused intensity of someone who saw mechanical problems as puzzles to be solved rather than obstacles to be endured. When he looked at the dismantled aircraft gun, he was already calculating modifications. Brennan had been watching Kessler for 3 months, ever since the corporal had arrived with the latest batch of replacements from the States. During training exercises, Kessler had demonstrated an unusual ability to diagnose and repair equipment failures that stumped other Marines. Radio sets that developed mysterious signal problems suddenly worked perfectly after 10 minutes with Kessler's toolkit. Vehicle engines that ran rough according to specifications ran smooth after he adjusted components that the technical manuals said should not be adjusted. More importantly, Kessler had a mechanical philosophy that aligned with Brennan's tactical experience. Standard operating procedures were baselines, not absolute requirements. Real-world conditions demanded real-world solutions, and real-world solutions often required going beyond what the manual considered acceptable. The conversation that night started with technical specifications and moved quickly into tactical necessities. The M1919 machine gun delivered reliable, sustained fire from a stable platform, but it required a minimum crew of 2 men and took 90 seconds to transition from movement to firing position. In assault operations across difficult terrain, those 90 seconds represented an eternity during which advancing riflemen were exposed to enemy fire without suppressive support. Kessler explained his background while examining the aircraft gun's bolt assembly. Nebraska farm country, where equipment failure meant crop loss and crop loss meant bankruptcy. His father had operated farm equipment for 27 years without a serious accident, following every safety protocol and maintenance schedule with religious precision. The combine harvester that killed him had been inspected according to manufacturer requirements 2 days before the accident. The drive shaft had passed all standard tests. The microfracture that caused the catastrophic failure was not detectable with conventional inspection methods. After the funeral, 16-year-old Dalton had spent 3 months learning everything he could about metallurgy, stress analysis, and failure modes. Not because he wanted to become an engineer, but because he needed to understand how something could be wrong even when all the specifications said it was right. The knowledge had served him well maintaining farm equipment, then aircraft engines at Patterson Field before the war. And now, Marine Corps equipment that often performed differently in combat than it did during peacetime testing. The technical challenge was straightforward but complex. The AN/M2 fired standard .30 caliber ammunition from a bolt system that was mechanically similar to the M1919 but operated at nearly 3 times the cyclic rate. The aircraft mount absorbed recoil through a complex system of springs and dampeners that distributed the force across the airframe. An infantry adaptation would need to control that recoil while providing a stable firing platform for a single operator. Brennan described the tactical requirement. A weapon that could be carried by 1 Marine, deployed in under 10 seconds, and deliver suppressive fire intense enough to force enemy gunners to seek cover rather than maintain aimed fire at advancing troops. The psychological effect was as important as the mechanical effect. Infantry assault succeeded when the defenders hesitated, and defenders hesitated when incoming fire was too intense to ignore. Kessler studied the weapon components while Brennan talked. The bolt assembly was robust, but would require modification to interface with a shoulder stock. The barrel was air-cooled and designed for intermittent rather than sustained fire, which meant heat management would be critical. The feed mechanism was designed for aircraft ammunition belts that were different from standard infantry ammunition configurations, and the entire system would need electrical power for the solenoid trigger, which meant either batteries or hand-cranked generation. The conversation continued past midnight, moving from theoretical possibilities to practical specifications. By 1 a.m., they had identified the major engineering challenges. By 2 a.m., they had developed preliminary solutions. By 3 a.m., they had committed to what both men understood was a violation of multiple Marine Corps regulations regarding unauthorized equipment modifications. The next 3 weeks were spent in careful preparation. Kessler needed to acquire materials without attracting attention from supply personnel who might question why a machine gunner needed sheet metal, electrical components, and welding equipment. He developed cover stories about training aids, equipment maintenance, and personal projects that were technically not lies, but were certainly not complete explanations. The most critical component was the stock assembly. The AN/M2 had spade grips designed for aircraft mounts, which were useless for shoulder-fired operation. Kessler needed to fabricate a stock that would control recoil, position the weapon correctly for aimed fire, and interface with the aircraft gun's bolt system without compromising the mechanical timing that made the high rate of fire possible. He started with a damaged M1 Garand that had been struck by shrapnel during a training accident. The wooden stock was cracked beyond repair, but the steel components were serviceable. Kessler cut away the damaged sections and began modifying what remained to accept the aircraft gun's action. The work required precision welding to join steel components that had been manufactured to different tolerances for different applications. The trigger mechanism presented the most complex challenge. Aircraft machine guns used electrical firing systems that were activated by switches rather than mechanical triggers. The electrical system allowed for precise timing and rapid cycling, but required a power source and control circuitry that did not exist in standard infantry weapons. Kessler designed a solenoid system that could be activated by a conventional trigger pull, but would deliver the electrical impulse necessary to fire the aircraft gun. The solenoid itself was fabricated from components salvaged from damaged radio equipment. Steel from antenna assemblies provided the electromagnetic core. Copper wire from field telephone systems provided the windings. Battery cells from field radios provided the electrical power. The entire assembly was housed in a waterproof case fabricated from aluminum sheeting and mounted beneath the modified stock where it would be protected but accessible for maintenance. Testing the electrical system required careful planning to avoid detection. Kessler conducted initial tests using a modified ammunition cartridge that contained flash powder instead of a bullet. The system worked, but the timing was inconsistent. The solenoid response varied with temperature and battery voltage, causing erratic firing rates that would be unacceptable in combat. He spent 2 weeks redesigning the control circuitry to provide consistent electrical output regardless of environmental conditions. The mechanical integration proved equally challenging. The aircraft gun's bolt system operated with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Any modification that affected the timing or alignment of moving parts could cause catastrophic failure when the weapon was fired. Kessler used precision measuring tools borrowed from the aircraft maintenance shop to verify that his modifications maintained the critical relationships between bolt, barrel, and firing mechanism. The sight system required a complete redesign. Aircraft machine guns were fired at targets hundreds or thousands of yards away, using computing sights that automatically adjusted for aircraft speed and target movement. Infantry machine guns needed simple, robust sights that could be quickly aligned with targets at ranges from 50 to 400 yards. Kessler mounted a modified Browning automatic rifle rear sight on the aircraft gun's receiver and fabricated a front sight post from a steel rod. The bipod attachment required careful consideration of balance and stability. The aircraft gun's center of gravity was different from standard infantry machine guns, which meant that standard bipod mounting points would not provide optimal stability. Kessler calculated the optimal mounting position and welded bipod legs from damaged BAR components to the aircraft gun's barrel housing. By early December, the modified weapon existed as a functional prototype. It weighed 25 pounds, loaded with a 100-round ammunition belt, compared to 31 pounds for the standard M1919. The cyclic rate of fire was 1,200 rounds per minute, compared to 400 to 500 for the standard weapon. Theoretical calculations suggested that the weapon could engage targets 3 times faster than conventional machine guns, with comparable accuracy at infantry combat ranges. But theoretical calculations were not combat performance. The weapon needed to be tested under conditions that simulated actual battlefield stress, and such testing could not be conducted without attracting official attention that might end the project before it could prove its worth. Kessler and Brennan agreed that the first real test would have to wait until combat conditions provided both the necessity and the opportunity. The weapon received its unofficial designation during a late-night conversation in the maintenance shed. Several names were considered and rejected. Stinger was too similar to existing military nomenclature. Hornet suggested something smaller and less substantial than the device they had created. Havoc captured both the destructive potential and the unorthodox nature of the weapon. More importantly, it was a name that could be used in casual conversation without immediately identifying what they were discussing. Training with the Havoc began in early January 1945, conducted during off-duty hours at remote sections of the firing range where noise would not attract attention. The weapon performed exactly as calculated in terms of rate of fire and accuracy, but revealed practical considerations that had not been apparent during theoretical planning. The high cyclic rate meant that a 100-round ammunition belt could be expended in 5 to 7 seconds of sustained firing. This provided devastating short-term firepower, but created enormous logistical requirements for ammunition resupply. The heat generated by rapid fire was more intense than expected. The aircraft gun's barrel was designed to be cooled by 300-mile-per-hour airflows during dive bombing operations. In static ground positions, there was no airflow, and sustained firing quickly heated the barrel to temperatures that affected accuracy and could potentially cause mechanical failure. Kessler developed firing techniques that maximized effectiveness while managing heat buildup, but the thermal limitations remained a significant constraint. The electrical firing system performed reliably under range conditions, but consumed battery power faster than anticipated. A standard radio battery pack provided power for approximately 200 rounds of firing, which meant that extended combat operations would require either frequent battery replacement or alternative power sources. Kessler experimented with hand-crank generators and solar charging systems, but none proved practical for field deployment. Despite these limitations, the Havoc demonstrated capabilities that no standard infantry weapon could match. Targets that would require sustained fire from conventional machine guns to suppress could be neutralized with brief bursts from the modified aircraft gun. The psychological effect of the higher rate of fire was immediately apparent even during training exercises. Marines playing the role of enemy troops instinctively sought cover when subjected to Havoc fire, even when they understood intellectually that the exercise was not dangerous. Have you ever built or modified equipment to solve a problem that official methods could not handle effectively? Share your experience in the comments. Let us learn from each other. Word of the project spread through careful, unofficial channels. Brennan described the weapon's capabilities to selected non-commissioned officers who had demonstrated both technical competence and tactical understanding. The responses were mixed, but generally positive. Marines who had experienced the limitations of standard equipment in combat were intrigued by the possibilities. Officers who prioritized regulatory compliance over innovation were skeptical or openly hostile. Lieutenant Morrison, the company's weapons officer, represented the institutional resistance that innovations faced within military organizations. Morrison was 26 years old, a Naval Academy graduate who had been commissioned directly into the Marine Corps without prior enlisted experience. His understanding of weapons came from textbooks and manufacturer specifications rather than field experience with equipment failures and improvisations. When Morrison learned about the Havoc project through unofficial channels, his reaction was immediate and predictable. Aircraft weapons were not designed for ground combat. Unauthorized modifications violated safety protocols that existed to protect Marines from equipment failures. The Marine Corps had decades of experience with weapons development, and that experience had produced equipment that was tested, reliable, and standardized across all units. Morrison's objections were technically correct, but tactically irrelevant. The M1919 was indeed a thoroughly tested and reliable weapon that had proven effective in defensive operations across multiple theaters of war. But the conditions at Iwo Jima would be different from previous campaigns. Intelligence reports described defensive positions that had been constructed by experienced engineers with unlimited time and resources. Standard tactical approaches would be predictably ineffective against fortifications designed specifically to counter those approaches. Brennan argued that battlefield conditions required battlefield solutions, and that innovations developed by Marines with direct combat experience were more likely to be effective than equipment designed by engineers who had never been shot at. Morrison maintained that discipline and standardization were fundamental to military effectiveness, and that individual innovations, regardless of their apparent merit, undermined the systematic approaches that allowed large military organizations to function effectively. The debate continued through January and into February, conducted in maintenance areas and training facilities where official oversight was minimal. Other Marines listened, contributed their own perspectives, and gradually divided into camps that supported either innovation or standardization. The division was not absolute. Many Marines recognized merit in both approaches and understood that the real test would come during combat operations, where theoretical considerations would be secondary to practical results. Captain Reynolds, the company commander, became aware of the controversy, but chose not to take official notice of activities that were technically outside regulations but were not explicitly prohibited by specific orders. Reynolds was 34 years old, a veteran of Guadalcanal and Bougainville, who had learned that successful combat operations often depended on initiatives that originated at the squad level rather than directives from higher command levels. Reynolds understood that the Havoc project represented a test of competing military philosophies. The institutional approach emphasized standardization, regulatory compliance, and systematic implementation of proven methods. The pragmatic approach emphasized adaptation, innovation, and immediate solutions to immediate problems. Both approaches had historical justification, and both had contributed to military successes and failures. Rather than resolve the debate through command authority, Reynolds allowed it to continue while making unofficial preparations for both possibilities. If the Havoc proved effective during combat operations, official recognition and possible integration into standard procedures would be considered. If the weapon failed during combat, or if its use created disciplinary problems that compromised unit effectiveness, the project would be terminated and standard equipment would be used for all subsequent operations. This approach satisfied neither the innovation advocates nor the standardization supporters, but it provided a framework for testing ideas under combat conditions where their true value could be assessed. It also reflected the military reality that company commanders had limited authority to approve major equipment modifications, but broad discretion regarding training methods and minor procedural variations that fell within the scope of unit-level initiative. The final testing and preparation phase began in early February, when it became apparent that major combat operations were imminent. Training exercises became more intense and more realistic, equipment inspections became more frequent and more thorough, and opportunities for unofficial weapons testing became more limited and more carefully planned. Kessler used this period to refine Havoc's mechanical systems and develop tactical procedures that maximized the weapon's effectiveness while minimizing its limitations. He fabricated spare components for the most critical systems and developed field-expedient repair procedures that could be implemented under combat conditions. He also trained 2 other Marines in basic maintenance procedures, ensuring that weapons knowledge would not be lost if he became a casualty. The training program emphasized speed of deployment, ammunition conservation, and coordinated tactics that integrated the Havoc's capabilities with conventional infantry weapons. The high rate of fire made the weapon ideal for suppressive missions that lasted for brief periods, but the ammunition consumption made sustained defensive operations impractical without massive logistical support. Kessler developed a tactical concept that treated the Havoc as a specialized tool for specific situations rather than a general replacement for standard machine guns. During assault operations, the weapon would provide intense suppressive fire for brief periods, allowing riflemen to advance under cover. During defensive operations, the weapon would be held in reserve for critical moments when maximum firepower was needed to break up enemy attacks or suppress particularly dangerous threats. The concept required coordination with other weapon systems and careful management of ammunition supplies, but it offered capabilities that no standard infantry weapon could provide. Most importantly, it represented a solution that had been developed by Marines for Marines, based on direct experience with the limitations of standard equipment and the requirements of actual combat operations. As February progressed and departure for combat operations approached, the Havoc project moved from experimental status to operational preparation. The weapon was ready. The tactical procedures were developed, the training was complete, and the philosophical debate between innovation and standardization was about to be resolved by the ultimate test of military effectiveness: performance under fire against an enemy who had spent months preparing to kill everyone who attempted to assault his positions. The volcanic sands of Iwo Jima would determine whether improvised weapons built in maintenance sheds could triumph over factory-produced equipment designed in corporate laboratories. They would determine whether individual initiative could overcome institutional resistance. And they would determine whether Dalton Kessler was a visionary who understood solutions that escaped military engineers, or a fool who risked lives on unproven theories about mechanical modifications. The transport ships departed Hawaii on February 14th. In the cargo hold, carefully wrapped and concealed among standard equipment, the Havoc waited for its test. 5 days later, when the landing craft approached the beaches of Iwo Jima under concentrated enemy fire, that test would begin with a violence and intensity that would prove definitively whether innovation or doctrine would triumph in the volcanic ash of the most heavily fortified position the Japanese had ever constructed. The landing craft struck the beach of Iwo Jima at 8:47 a.m. on February 19, 1945. The volcanic sand was unlike anything the Marines had encountered before. Black, coarse, and unstable, it shifted under every footstep like ball bearings. The beach sloped upward in terraces that provided no natural cover, each level dominated by Japanese positions that had been precisely surveyed and registered for artillery fire. Kessler hit the sand with the Havoc across his back and 50 pounds of additional equipment distributed across his combat pack and ammunition pouches. The weapon felt different in combat than it had during training, heavier, more unwieldy, but also more substantial. The electrical firing system hummed quietly under the modified stock, drawing power from battery packs that represented 3 months of careful preparation. Around him, Marines from Company A spread across the beach in the rehearsed patterns that had been drilled during weeks of training. The reality of combat immediately revealed the inadequacy of peacetime preparation. Japanese machine gun positions that intelligence had failed to identify opened fire from concealed locations. Mortar rounds began falling with mechanical precision, their explosions throwing volcanic ash and metal fragments across the landing zone. Private Hendricks died within minutes of reaching the beach. A burst from a Type 92 heavy machine gun caught him as he attempted to advance beyond the waterline. The rounds struck his chest and abdomen, spinning him around before dropping him into the black sand. The corpsman reached him within 30 seconds, but the wounds were beyond field treatment. Hendricks died calling for his mother, his blood soaking into volcanic ash that absorbed it without trace. Sergeant Blake's machine gun crew established a position 20 yards from the water's edge and began the 90-second process of setting up their M1919 for sustained fire. The Japanese had anticipated this location and timing. Mortar rounds bracketed the position before the crew could complete their setup. Blake was killed instantly by a direct hit. His gunner, Private Martinez, lost both legs below the knee, but survived long enough to scream for medical attention that could not reach him under the concentrated fire. Standard tactics called for suppressive fire to cover advancing troops, but the standard weapons could not be deployed fast enough to provide that suppression. The Japanese had studied American assault methods for months and had prepared defensive responses that turned doctrine into death sentences. Every movement drew immediate fire from multiple positions. Every attempt to establish supporting weapons resulted in concentrated counter-battery fire that eliminated the weapons before they could become effective. Kessler understood that conventional approaches would fail completely. The Havoc had been designed for exactly these conditions: rapid deployment, intense suppressive fire, and immediate tactical effect without the time-consuming setup procedures that made standard weapons vulnerable during the critical first minutes of an assault. At 9:15 a.m., with Company A pinned down 50 yards from the waterline and taking casualties every minute, Kessler made the decision to deploy his weapon despite the complete absence of cover. He removed the Havoc from its carrying case, extended the bipod legs, and loaded a 100-round ammunition belt. The electrical system activated with a soft click, indicating that the solenoid firing mechanism was ready. The nearest Japanese position was a camouflaged pillbox 75 yards northwest of his location. Intelligence had failed to identify it during pre-assault reconnaissance, but its position was revealed by muzzle flashes from the Type 92 machine gun that had killed Hendricks. The position was well constructed, with firing ports that were angled to provide overlapping coverage while minimizing exposure to return fire. Kessler aimed the Havoc at the pillbox and activated the electrical firing system. The weapon responded instantly, delivering 1,200 rounds per minute in a sustained burst that lasted 4 seconds. 48 rounds struck the target area in a concentrated pattern that overwhelmed the structural defenses of the position. The Japanese machine gun fell silent. Movement inside the position ceased. The psychological effect on nearby Marines was immediate. They had watched conventional weapons fail repeatedly during the first hour of the assault. The Havoc's demonstration of overwhelming firepower provided proof that Japanese positions could be neutralized and that the assault could succeed. Marines who had been seeking cover began advancing. Sergeant Williams organized a squad-level assault on the neutralized position. Within minutes, Company A was moving inland for the first time since hitting the beach, but Havoc's effectiveness came with a cost that became apparent immediately. The 100-round ammunition belt had been consumed in 4 seconds of firing. Kessler's calculations had predicted this consumption rate, but experiencing it under combat conditions revealed the enormous logistical challenge that high-performance weapons created. He needed 4 more ammunition belts to sustain operations for 1 minute of actual firing time. The ammunition resupply point was located 200 yards back toward the beach, where landing craft continued to deliver supplies under sporadic Japanese artillery fire. Kessler would have to cross open ground, under observation from enemy positions, carrying ammunition that weighed 6 pounds per 100-round belt. The trip would take approximately 3 minutes each direction, during which Company A would lack the suppressive fire capability that the Havoc provided. Kessler began the first of what would become 8 trips between his fighting position and the beach resupply point. The volcanic sand made every step difficult, shifting under his boots and requiring constant adjustments to maintain balance and direction. Japanese snipers had identified the supply route and were engaging targets of opportunity with carefully aimed fire. Halfway to the beach, Kessler encountered Private Colton Bridger, an 18-year-old rifleman from Ohio who had been struck by shrapnel from a mortar round. The wound was in his left thigh, painful but not immediately life-threatening. Bridger was conscious but unable to walk without assistance. Standard procedure called for wounded Marines to remain in position until stretcher bearers could evacuate them, but stretcher bearers were not available under the current level of enemy fire. Kessler made a decision that would define his approach to the entire operation. He lifted Bridger onto his back and carried him to the beach while running under enemy fire. The additional weight slowed his movement and made him a larger target, but it also meant that a wounded Marine would receive medical treatment that could save his life. At the beach, Corman took custody of Bridger and began treating his wounds. Kessler loaded 4 ammunition belts into his pack, grabbed 2 additional belts to carry by hand, and began the return trip to his fighting position. The round trip had taken 6 minutes. During his absence, Company A had been forced to halt their advance because they lacked suppressive fire to cover their movement. Japanese defenders had used the respite to adjust their positions and concentrate fire on the most advanced Marine positions. The second engagement began at 9:52 a.m., when Kessler identified a second Japanese pillbox that was preventing Company A from advancing toward the base of Mount Suribachi. This position was larger and more heavily constructed than the first, with multiple firing ports and what appeared to be a crew-served weapon larger than a machine gun. Standard infantry weapons would require sustained fire over several minutes to have any effect on such a position. Kessler loaded a fresh ammunition belt and engaged the target with a 7-second burst that delivered 84 rounds in a concentrated pattern. The volume of fire was sufficient to penetrate the firing ports and neutralize the crew inside. The position fell silent, and Company A resumed their advance. But once again, the Havoc's ammunition was exhausted, and once again, Kessler faced the choice between maintaining firepower and abandoning wounded Marines. The second trip to the beach included 2 wounded Marines. Private Dakota Fleming had been struck by rifle fire in the right shoulder. Lance Corporal Trace Whitmore had received multiple fragment wounds from a grenade explosion. Both men were conscious but unable to move effectively on their own. Kessler carried Fleming on his back and helped Whitmore walk, supporting his weight while maintaining a pace that would minimize their exposure time. The volcanic ash was beginning to affect Kessler's equipment in ways that had not been anticipated during training. The fine particles worked their way into every mechanism, including the Havoc's electrical firing system and belt feed mechanism. After the second engagement, Kessler noticed that the solenoid trigger was responding more slowly and that the belt feed was not advancing as smoothly as it had during the morning. If you're still watching up to this point, you probably feel Kessler's determination like we do. Leave a gear emoji for those who know that real innovation comes from the field level, not the boardroom. The third trip to the beach revealed the full scope of the logistical challenge that the Havoc represented. Kessler was consuming ammunition faster than any single Marine could reasonably be expected to resupply under combat conditions. The weapon's tactical effectiveness was undeniable, but its operational sustainability required either additional personnel dedicated to ammunition handling or a dramatic reduction in the rate of fire. Kessler chose to maintain maximum rate of fire while accepting the physical demands of continuous resupply operations. The decision reflected his understanding that Company A's success depended on maintaining psychological pressure on Japanese defenders. The moment the intense suppressive fire stopped, enemy positions would reactivate and the advance would stall. Sustained pressure required sustained ammunition consumption, regardless of the personal cost to the weapon operator. The physical demands were increasing with each trip. The volcanic ash was more abrasive than normal sand, wearing through boot leather and working its way into socks and clothing. Kessler's feet were beginning to blister where the ash rubbed against skin. His shoulders ached from carrying wounded Marines and heavy ammunition loads. His hands were raw from gripping ammunition belts and weapon components that had been heated by sustained firing. During the fourth trip, Kessler made a calculation that would become part of Marine Corps legend. His boots were disintegrating from contact with the volcanic ash. The leather soles were worn through in multiple places, and the uppers were beginning to separate from the sole assemblies. The boots were adding weight and reducing traction without providing meaningful protection from the abrasive surface. At 10:45 a.m., Kessler removed his boots and helmet, reducing his equipment load by approximately 5 pounds. The decision seemed irrational to Marines who observed it. Volcanic ash was sharp and hot. Moving across it without foot protection would be painful and potentially injurious. But Kessler understood that speed was more important than comfort, and that every second of exposure time increased the probability of being hit by enemy fire. The barefoot decision proved tactically sound. Kessler could feel the terrain through his feet and adjust his gait accordingly. His speed increased noticeably, reducing transit time and exposure. The pain was significant, but manageable. More importantly, the psychological effect on other Marines was immediate and positive. If their machine gunner was willing to run barefoot across volcanic ash to maintain their suppressive fire, they could endure whatever discomfort their own situation required. Trips 5 and 6 established the pattern that would define the rest of the operation. Each trip included at least one wounded Marine who required evacuation. Each trip delivered enough ammunition for 2 to 3 engagements. Each engagement neutralized Japanese positions that were preventing Company A from advancing, and each engagement pushed the Havoc's mechanical systems closer to the failure point. The weapon was not designed for sustained operation under combat conditions. Aircraft machine guns were intended for intermittent use during aerial engagements, where ambient airflow provided cooling, and where electrical systems were maintained by trained technicians between missions. Ground combat provided no cooling airflow and no maintenance opportunities. The Havoc was operating far beyond its design parameters, and mechanical failure was becoming inevitable. By 11:30 a.m., the barrel was visibly discolored from heat. The solenoid trigger was firing in irregular patterns, sometimes delivering single rounds when sustained fire was intended, sometimes failing to fire at all. The belt feed mechanism was jamming periodically, requiring manual intervention to clear malfunctions. The electrical system was consuming battery power faster than predicted, and battery voltage was dropping below optimal operating levels. Despite these mechanical problems, the Havoc remained superior to standard infantry weapons in terms of tactical effectiveness. Even when firing in short, irregular bursts, it delivered more rounds on target in less time than conventional machine guns could achieve under ideal conditions. The psychological effect of the weapon's distinctive sound continued to influence Japanese defensive behavior, causing enemy gunners to seek cover even during brief engagements. The seventh trip coincided with a Japanese counterattack that had been organized in response to Company A's unexpected success in advancing beyond the beach. Japanese commanders had observed the effect of concentrated suppressive fire on their defensive positions, and had concluded that eliminating the source of that fire was essential to stopping the American advance. 3 Japanese soldiers moved forward under cover of mortar fire with the specific mission of destroying Kessler's weapon. They approached his position from multiple directions, using terrain features and smoke for concealment. The attack was coordinated and professionally executed, representing the kind of tactical adaptation that made Japanese defenders particularly dangerous opponents. Kessler identified the threat while returning from his 7th trip to the beach. He was carrying ammunition and could not effectively use his individual weapon while burdened with supplies. The Havoc was 200 yards away at his fighting position, but reaching it would require crossing open ground under direct observation from the approaching enemy soldiers. The tactical situation required immediate action with whatever resources were available. Kessler dropped his ammunition load and drew his sidearm, a standard issue 1911 pistol. The engagement that followed lasted less than 30 seconds, but demonstrated the kind of individual combat skills that separated experienced Marines from replacement personnel. The first Japanese soldier was eliminated at 15 yards with 2 pistol rounds to the chest. The second soldier attempted to flank Kessler's position, but was caught in the open when Kessler anticipated his movement. 3 rounds fired rapidly at 20-yard range achieved 2 hits that incapacitated the target. The third soldier broke contact and withdrew rather than continue the assault against an opponent who had demonstrated superior marksmanship skills. Kessler retrieved his ammunition and continued to his fighting position, where he loaded the Havoc for what would prove to be its final effective engagement. The weapon's mechanical condition had deteriorated to the point where sustained fire was no longer possible, but short bursts could still be delivered with acceptable accuracy. Company A had advanced to within 200 yards of Mount Suribachi's base, farther than any other unit had progressed during the first day of operations. The 8th and final trip to the beach included 3 wounded Marines, the largest number Kessler had attempted to evacuate during a single journey. The increased load slowed his movement significantly and increased his exposure time to dangerous levels. Japanese artillery had been adjusted to target the supply route, and incoming rounds were landing with increasing accuracy. During the return leg of the 8th trip, Kessler was struck by shell fragments from a near miss. The wounds were superficial but painful, adding to the accumulated stress of 8 hours of continuous combat operations. His feet were bleeding from multiple cuts inflicted by the volcanic ash. His hands were blistered from handling hot weapon components. His uniform was soaked with perspiration, blood, and volcanic grit. The Havoc fired its last effective burst at 1:15 p.m., neutralizing a Japanese observation post that had been directing artillery fire against Company A's positions. The electrical system failed completely during this engagement, ending the weapon's usefulness as anything more than a standard bolt-action rifle. The ammunition consumption during 8 hours of operations totaled 2,100 rounds, far exceeding any individual weapon's normal expenditure during an entire campaign. Sergeant Brennan had been observing Kessler's performance throughout the day and had reached conclusions about both the tactical effectiveness of the modified weapon and the broader implications for Marine Corps equipment development. That evening, while Company A consolidated their positions for overnight defense, Brennan began planning the construction of additional Havoc weapons using lessons learned from the first day's combat experience. The process required careful coordination with other maintenance personnel who possessed the technical skills necessary for precision modification work. Brennan identified 5 Marines with appropriate backgrounds and began informal discussions about equipment improvement projects that might benefit their units. The conversations were conducted carefully, without explicit reference to unauthorized modifications, but with sufficient technical detail to communicate the possibilities that existed. Within a week, 5 additional Havoc weapons had been constructed using improved techniques that addressed some of the reliability issues identified during Kessler's initial combat employment. The weapons were distributed to other companies within the regiment, where they provided similar tactical advantages during subsequent operations on Iwo Jima. The cumulative effect was a measurable improvement in suppressive fire capabilities that influenced the success rate of infantry assaults throughout the campaign. Japanese intelligence services detected the change in American tactics and equipment within 10 days of the initial landing. Combat reports from frontline units described American automatic weapons with unprecedented rates of fire and unusual sound signatures. Technical analysis of captured ammunition and weapon fragments revealed modifications that had not been observed in previous campaigns. The Japanese response included tactical adjustments designed to counter the increased suppressive fire capabilities and intelligence efforts aimed at determining the source and scope of the American equipment modifications. Counter-sniper operations were intensified to target American automatic weapons positions. Artillery concentrations were adjusted to saturate areas where the modified weapons were likely to be deployed. And defensive positions were redesigned to reduce their vulnerability to the kind of concentrated fire that the Havoc weapons delivered. These adjustments reduced but did not eliminate the tactical advantage that the modified weapons provided. More importantly, they demonstrated that field-level innovations could influence enemy behavior and force adaptive responses that affected the overall conduct of military operations. The implications extended beyond individual weapons to broader questions about the relationship between standardization and innovation within military organizations. Captain Reynolds formally reported the existence of modified weapons to regimental headquarters on February 28, 9 days after the initial landing. His report described the weapons' tactical effectiveness while acknowledging that their construction violated existing regulations regarding equipment modification. Reynolds recommended that the weapons be allowed to continue in service pending a formal evaluation of their impact on unit effectiveness and military discipline. The regimental response was carefully worded to avoid either explicit approval or explicit prohibition of the modifications. Colonel Harrison acknowledged the report and directed that weapons performance data be collected for subsequent analysis by appropriate technical authorities. This response allowed the weapons to remain in service while protecting higher command levels from responsibility for officially authorizing unauthorized modifications. The compromise satisfied no one completely, but reflected the practical reality that combat effectiveness often required flexibility in regulatory enforcement. The modified weapons worked. They saved Marine lives and contributed to mission success. Prohibiting their use would reduce combat effectiveness without providing compensating benefits. Officially authorizing their use would establish precedents that could undermine equipment standardization and military discipline. On March 1, 1945, 11 days after the initial landing, Kessler volunteered for a reconnaissance patrol tasked with locating Japanese positions that had been harassing Company A's advance toward the northern part of the island. The patrol consisted of 19 Marines led by Lieutenant Morrison, the same officer who had initially opposed the Havoc project, but had subsequently observed its effectiveness during combat operations. Morrison's attitude toward improvised equipment had been modified by 11 days of combat experience that demonstrated the limitations of standard doctrine when applied to unprecedented tactical situations. He remained committed to the principles of military discipline and standardization, but he had developed an appreciation for innovations that contributed to mission success and Marine survival. The patrol moved out at 7 a.m. under overcast skies that provided concealment from Japanese observers, but also limited visibility for the Marines attempting to identify enemy positions. The terrain was a mixture of volcanic ridges and ravines that provided numerous opportunities for ambush. Japanese defenders had established concealed positions throughout the area, supported by interconnected tunnel systems that allowed movement without surface exposure. At 7:53 a.m., the patrol was engaged by a Japanese sniper firing from a concealed position approximately 200 yards northeast of their location. The first shot struck Kessler in the head, causing immediate fatal injuries. He died instantly, at age 23, on the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. The patrol returned fire and called for mortar support, but the sniper's position could not be definitively located. The patrol completed its mission, identifying the Japanese positions they had been sent to locate, but the cost included the loss of the Marine, who had demonstrated that individual initiative could overcome institutional resistance. Kessler was buried in the 5th Marine Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima with a wooden cross marking his grave. On February 19, 1946, 1 year after his actions on the beach, His mother received the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the Nebraska state capitol. The citation credited him with destroying multiple enemy positions, evacuating wounded Marines under fire, and demonstrating conspicuous gallantry. The Havoc weapons continued in service through the end of the Iwo Jima campaign and were used during operations on Okinawa. The Marine Corps quietly incorporated field modification procedures into its equipment development protocols, acknowledging that combat conditions often revealed capabilities that laboratory testing could not identify. Dalton Kessler proved that innovation begins with individuals who understand problems that escape institutional recognition. His legacy lived not in official commendations, but in the survival of Marines who came home because he was willing to trust salvaged aircraft parts more than regulatory compliance. Sometimes the best solutions come from those who have grease on their hands and are willing to break rules to save lives. If this story moved you, please hit like and subscribe. We need your support to continue sharing these forgotten heroes.